Friends, the peace of Christ be with you. A reading from the Gospel according to Matthew. Glory to you, O God. I need to say a few words of preface before I read this. You know, I work hard to come up with the right tone of voice as I read, because tone of voice communicates a message. I learned that on my dog. I used to practice my early sermons in my 20s on my collie. What I found was when I got into the preacher voice, she would bark. When I lowered the tone and got warm and compassionate, he would listen and sometimes fall asleep. But I remember reading this, having this passage read to me so many times. And this is the passage about Peter stepping out of the boat. He falls and sinks, and this line was read with shame and condemnation. You of little faith, why did you doubt? And then the preacher would go on with this message that if you left the boat, you left the congregation, went off on your own, thinking you were following Jesus, and you sank, maybe Jesus would come and save you, and you were shamed for failing because you didn't have enough faith. Mm-hmm. So I've tried to get that tone out of this. And what helps me is the image of my children taking their first steps. And when they fall, what do? It's okay, honey. Come on. Try again. Or when I think of beloved Catholic Church, walking on water, taking steps, and Jesus reaching out to help us. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get in the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. And after he dismissed them, he went up on the mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. And when the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. It's a ghost, they said, and they cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." "Jesus, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, beginning to sink. He cried out, "Jesus, save me!" And immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." This is a story about our brother Jesus. Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Get two homilies because you have two priests. Thank you. Well, many of you remember from your history books the story of Harriet Tubman, who was an abolitionist, a social activist, and a Union spy during the Civil War. In her work in leading enslaved people to freedom through the Underground Railroad, she knew what it meant to hide. As a child, Harriet Tubman once hid in a pig pen, competing with the swine for scraps of food after spilling sugar in her mistress's house, fearing that she would be beaten. Later, while trying to rescue her brothers from being sold, she hid with them in a corn crib for an entire day before escaping to the north under the cover of night. Station masters along the Underground Railroad hid her and her passengers in carts beneath hay, market goods, and manure. Once she even hid in plain sight by pulling the strings that tethered some chickens in her arms, causing them to flap their wings and fall to the ground. She pretended to chase those loose chickens, distracting her former master who was walking past her, disguised by the old flustered woman that she pretended to be. At Mount Horeb, the mountain of God, Elijah also hid like a fugitive in a cave. He had enraged Queen Jezebel, the wife of King Ahab, by confronting the worshippers of Baal and exposing her prophets as frauds. Well, Jezebel's ego was a little bit bruised. She didn't take kindly to public humiliation. So she declared Elijah an outlaw, a bad hombre, the worst of the worst, in order that he be executed. Elijah did what most of us might do in a situation like that. He ran and he hid. But Elijah was not only afraid, he was depleted and disillusioned after confronting Queen Jezebel's corrupt power. After all, he was God's prophet. He had risked himself for a just cause. So where was God when Elijah needed God the most? Where is God when we are tired of fighting the good fight? When the Harriet Tubmans of our day are detained, denied due process, shot in our streets? Where is God when we grow weary in our No Kings rallies, our pride parades, our efforts to support our immigrant neighbors, to work to feed the hungry and struggle for the dignity of our trans and queer siblings, or simply our efforts to live our authentic selves openly? Where is God when greed and corruption flourish, when the powerful trample the rights of others, when they drop bombs on innocent civilians, start unjust wars, and hoard the world's wealth for themselves? Where is God when dictators and bullies seem to rule the world? Elijah's story tells us that God is not found in intimidation, public shaming, cruel rhetoric, scapegoating, or in the weaponizing of the law. God is not in spectacle, distractions, or the loudest voice in the room. God is in the whisper. God's presence is quieter, more interior, more relational, more discerned only after the noise clears and the chaos subsides. Then God's Spirit comes to minister to us. In 2018, 12 boys and their soccer coach were trapped deep inside a flooded cave in Thailand. Outside, everything was frantic. The rain kept falling, pumps were running, divers were risking their lives. Families were waiting in agony. Reporters were shouting questions. But deep inside the cave, the boys survived by doing the opposite. Their coach helped them to stay still, to conserve energy, to breathe slowly, to wait in the dark. And after days of silence and fear, they heard a voice coming across the water. A diver had found them. But before they were rescued, before the danger was over, before they could return to daylight, the first gift that they received was a voice. How many of you? He asked. And then it said, you are very strong. That's not so far from today's gospel. The disciples were caught in chaos, wind, waves, darkness, and fear. Jesus does not first remove the storm. He comes to them in the middle of the storm. And before the wind dies down, before the boat is safe, first gift he gives, also a voice. Take courage. I am. I am who I am. Jesus, in his full divine nature, do not be afraid. Then Peter steps out in faith. And when fear overtakes him and he begins to think, Jesus catches him. Harriet Tubman did not overcome fear because she never felt it. She overcame fear because freedom became much larger than fear. As she once said, there was one of two things I had a right to, liberty or death. If I could not have one, I would have the other. So I found myself thinking this week about our own journey as a community, the boat that we have been in together. 5 years ago, many of us felt caught in a storm. The tension between our call to social justice and the fear that that stirred in others. Those who wanted us to take our social justice efforts out of the church, away from the bishop's watchful eyes, away from the church's donors who might object. We had to separate ourselves from that chaos and take time apart from the parish that we had loved for so many years to discern what to do next. We needed space to hear God's whisper saying to us, become the community that you long to belong to. So we launched our boat into the sea. There have been a lot of choppy waters, like being confronted on social media with the haters, right? And the farmers market, people who tell us we can't really be Catholic and do what we're doing. And there have been some brave moments, like remember our very first Pride Parade when we had the Pope visit everybody, right? It was fun, you know? Or ordaining a woman priest. That took courage. Beginning a contemplative prayer group in our community here, bringing in outsiders from Beloved to join that, and committing to aiding our neighbors in hiding from ICE. It was a courageous decision. Like Peter, we stepped out in faith. Sometimes we gave in to doubt and fear. But the boat is more than a place surrounded by storms. It's a place that holds our fragile community while we learn to recognize Christ amid our fear. And Christ is not watching us from a distance. Christ is ready to catch us when we stumble. This is the kind of church we are called to be, not fear-driven, but courageous, contemplative enough to hear the whisper, inclusive enough to recognize Christ in every person who walks through that door. So here is God's challenge to us as we enter into our 6th year as a community. Will we make space for silence so we can hear the whisper? Will we resist mistaking God's voice for the voice of domination, the voice that abuses power and keeps us in our caves of fear? Will we step towards justice even when the waters are unstable? And will we not only reach for Christ's hand when we begin to sink, but become that hand for others? Beloved, Jesus is calling us. Take courage. I am. Do not be afraid. Amen.
Amen.